Good morning, everyone, or צהריים טובים. Early lunch for you over there in Israel, 11 o'clock here in Brussels. Welcome, my name is Ami Levin from the Economic Mission of Israel to the EU. Happy to see people joining our webinar on the European AI Act. I will start by reminding everybody that the session is recorded. So please take this into account, and that everybody is welcome and invited to submit their questions on the Q&A facility. I see people still joining, so I'm going to take one short pause before we actually begin with the speakers and the program that we have for us today. So I suggest we actually start. I'm going to start by a brief introduction of who we are and then present our speakers for today. So without further ado, I will try to share my screen. I hope you can see it now in presentation mode. So hello again, everybody. I am Ami Levin, heading the Trade and Economic Mission of Israel to the EU. Today, we are focusing on artificial intelligence, the EU AI Act, brief introduction of who we are and what we do at the Foreign Trade Administration of the Ministry of Economy, Misrad HaKalkala, here in Brussels. So the Foreign Trade Administration, our organization, is heading the government activities in increasing the Israeli export, also import, but we will not talk about that today. We also work to promote investment into Israel, to attract investment, and to manage our trade policy, that is to sign the relevant trade arrangements and agreements with trading partners. We do that by operating a very active network of commercial representatives and offices throughout the world. I'm going to show it on the map very soon. And as I said, to conclude the trade agreements, like the one that we have with the European Union, with the US, with Korea, and with other partners. And we also support exporters in their international activities, giving grants, participating in events, etc. This is where we are. We are very well placed all over the world, mainly in trade hubs. At the moment, we operate we are present in around 55 capitals and prime locations around the world. And this is the list. You have it on the right side of the presentation. As I said, we try to work and assist the Israeli economy and exporting communities. And this is our results for last year. We managed to facilitate more than $500 million of direct assistance to exporters. This was our direct contribution. We have managed to produce and organize over 2,500 business events and activities throughout the world. This would be trade delegations, trade exhibitions, webinars, etc. We assisted over 4,500 different exporters. And as you can see, we are very focused on arranging business-to-business activities, even though we also work with governments. Our mission in particular here in Brussels is focusing on working with the EU institutions, the various institutions. And our aim is to work with the Israeli international exporting and investment innovation community at large. That is, we aim to unlock what the EU does and make it more accessible and understandable to the Israeli economic ecosystem. And this is part of the effort actually that we're doing today. We're also negotiating with the EU the various arrangements and modifications we need to have in order to ensure that our exporters enjoy a level playing field in the EU market. And of course, we try to be active online, try to follow up on the various channels like LinkedIn. We have a web page. You're welcome to look us up in our export request management system. You can look it up in Google and submit your request to each and every one of the offices that I mentioned before. So that was my very brief presentation. about who we are. And with that, perhaps we can start the program of today. I will stop sharing my screen and have the distinct pleasure of having two top speakers on the hot topic of AI. And in particular, today we're going to focus on what's happening in the EU on AI. I'll start with the Israel side. A friend and a colleague, Dr. Ziv Katzir. Ziv is part of the Israeli Innovation Authority, the רשות החדשנות, as we know it in Israel. And in the last year or so, maybe a bit more, Ziv is heading the national program, infrastructure program for AI, surely a very relevant function. And Ziv, we wish you all success in this amazing endeavor. And in order to help us to understand what's happening in the EU, we have the pleasure of being joined by Dan Nechita. Dan is the head of cabinet of a very prominent European Parliament member, Dragos Tudorache, from the Renew Europe parliamentary group. Dan has been extremely instrumental in negotiating the AI Act. He knows the ins and outs of what's happened in the negotiations. And with his very kind help and expertise, our hope today is to try to understand the product, what actually was agreed, and what it means for different economic operators, companies, government, regulation, etc. We have at our disposal a bit less than 1 hour, so the challenge is immense, and the topic is extremely engaging and wide and very relevant to the people attending today. I see that we have exceeded 120 participants, so very happy and thankful for that. Without further ado, I will leave the floor now to Ziv to moderate the discussion with Dan, and hopefully we'll be able to cover the topic, at least part of it. So thank you very much, and I wish everybody a very successful session.
Thank you, Ami, and welcome, Dan. It's really a thrill to have you with us today. This session today, I'll start by saying it's being recorded. It's going to be uploaded to the YouTube channel of the Israel Innovation Authority within a few days. And as Ami mentioned earlier, everybody here is more than welcome to ask questions, post them on the Q&A channel, and we'll spend some time answering those at the end. So Dan, welcome. We're happy to have you here at the Innovation Over Lunch series, which today is conducted together with the Foreign Trade Administration. I'll start by saying that our audience today is probably somehow knowledgeable about the AI Act. We've been talking about that for a few months now, trying to get the Israeli innovation ecosystem prepared for the changes. But before we dive into the details, I think perhaps you can speak a little bit about what were the motivation, what were the goals that the European Union was trying to accomplish with the Act. Not the written word, but what were we intending to do?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ami, Ziv, everybody for inviting me here. Happy to be with you. That's a very good opening question. Because the European Union is such a complex body, you can't just ascribe one intention, but I can explain the logic of what the union is trying to do with the regulation on AI, but on other issues as well, because you probably know there's other digital files ongoing. So I think that the logic of the AI Act falls into a dual logic of the European Commission of building an ecosystem of trust and an ecosystem of excellence. Now, on the ecosystem of excellence, you have all the European funds that go into innovation, you have the supercomputers, you have opening up the supercomputers for startups, and so on, many initiatives meant to support directly innovation. But then there is another logic, which is we are looking at the rate of adoption, and adoption is fairly low of artificial intelligence. And that goes back a little bit to the idea of trust. The technology is not yet seen as trustworthy as, say, for example, a credit card. And if you remember in the beginning, the credit cards, the first wave of credit card adoption or debit card adoption was people will go to the ATM, pull out all their money, and still use cash. So you can develop basically e-commerce. And the regulation on AI, its main focus, if you look at a very high level, is to develop trust in those technologies. And the way you develop trust is by making them safer, especially in areas where people have questions about the technology, and those are the areas that can have a direct impact on health, safety, or fundamental rights. So the logic of the act is, let's protect in certain cases, in those what we call high-risk use cases, let's make sure that health, safety, fundamental rights are more protected. And therefore, there is a logical chain there. Therefore, technology will be more trustworthy. Therefore, it's going to lead to more adoption. Therefore, ultimately, it's going to lead to economic growth. So that's the big vision reason for the regulation. But I'm sure we'll talk more about, how does that balance out with supporting innovation and so on.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I think that if we have another hour, we can have like a cultural discussion of how, the different countries approach this test. But I can certainly agree that, trust is a fundamental infrastructure for allowing a technology to be adopted. I'll take a brief pause and ask our IT guy if you can just make sure that we have only 2 video boxes on the screen and the rest are hidden so that the audience can see us better. Thank you in advance. And I'll move to the next question, Dan. So within 2 years or so, right, the act is going to come into force, right? So how will the certification process for an AI-based product look like? So suppose I have my product, never mind what it does, and I want to get it certified and ready to be marketable in the EU. So how will it look like?
All right, so before we go, I'll go a little bit lower from the very ideological viewpoint that I presented earlier, and maybe spend 2 minutes on saying what the AI Act actually does. So what it does is it follows a product safety type of regulation model. That is, before placing a product on the market, certain categories of products that are considered to be in a risk category need to go and undergo a number of steps that is in a conformity assessment. I'll explain a little bit the types of categories that the AI Act regulates. So it's a risk-based approach. When it was proposed, it was estimated that it would cover anywhere between 10 and 15% of the AI systems on the market or supposed to be on the market. So that is, it really applies to a narrow category of AI products. And the best way to explain it is in a pyramid of risk. So at the very top, there is a few things that are outright prohibited. And those are, values-based things such as, for example, mass social scoring by the state that, leads to differential treatment of citizens within the European Union. And that's, something that China does. We don't want to do that. And that's outright prohibited, but it makes total sense. I don't think there's anybody trying to actually build that other than, a state that's non-democratic. Then you have the bulk of the regulation applying to what are deemed high-risk AI systems. And these are, conceptually, they're not bad AI systems. Rather, they can pose some risks. You might as well just call that category, risk category 1. Instead of saying, oh, they're high risk. And those are AI systems that deal, for example, with biometrics, that deal with making significant decisions in employment relationships, that deal with making significant decisions that impact somebody's life in education, that deal with law enforcement, migration, administration of justice. So these are very discrete categories that are very well listed. So there is actually a list. Here are the categories that are deemed to be high risk.
Kind of the more sensitive aspects of human life.
Exactly. Then there is another layer, which is basic transparency requirements for those who pose a medium risk, that is chatbots who could be deceiving or fake deep fakes. And for those, there's limited obligations in terms of transparency and disclosing to the end user that they're interacting with the system. And then most of the AI is unregulated. So if you're building an AI to grow tomatoes, this regulation doesn't apply to you. If you're building an AI to, I don't know, there's so many examples. So 80% of the AI out there is not covered by this regulation. Now, of course, with developments, the law has evolved, and then there's another risk-based two-tiered category dealing with the more powerful general purpose models. And that is, some models, and very well hidden in the text, there is a small definition of what that means over, probably over 1 billion parameters. Those have some transparency obligations when they grow to that particular size, which are basically just maintaining good documentation in a sense, and being able to provide it. And then the next layer, those models that are at the very frontier and they're very, very, very powerful, that might pose systemic risks. And that's a logic, reserved for a very few models in this moment. Those have additional obligations to interact with the regulator and to be aware of those risks, to mitigate those risks. So in 2 minutes, that's what the AI Act does. And I'll go back now to your question in terms of, okay, so how does that apply to me? The conformity assessment is basically a set of articles in the regulation that goes through some very, I would say, commonsensical obligations for the developers, for those who build the AI, and they have to do with having a risk management system in place, and there are some specifics on how that risk management system needs to look like, having good data governance in place, and that's, again, there's some specifics on that. Technical documentation, which I'm sure most people who build AI have that on hand. Transparency to deployers, that is, once you start selling your product, those who use it, so a police station in one member state, or a hospital somewhere, or an education institution, need to know exactly what your system does, to have very good instructions of use. And then, provisions on human oversight and cybersecurity. And this is a self-assessment logic. That is, it's not a third-party conformity assessment. This doesn't need to be done by somebody exterior to the company. It can be done internally, checking the product versus the requirements, and then maintaining the documentation, and before placing the product on the market, affixing the CE marking in one way or another on that product, which indicates that you've done that conformity assessment. So that's basically the whole logic.
So, we were told that there's going to be Sentinel-like standard within kind of fully detailed certification process, kind of like the ISO 9000 series, where you go for an internal audit and then go for external audit and so on and so forth. So is that like an additional option, the preferred option? How do you refer to that?
Well, standards work. I'm sure you are well aware. Standards work as an optional tool to get to conformity, right? So once you follow the standards, this regulation says you are in a presumption of conformity. It doesn't mean that you have to follow the standards. Of course, it's more effective if you know that following these standards will lead you to conformity. It's more effective to follow them. But that's the role of the standards, because they're not mandatory, in a legal way. So indeed, I think that once the standards are developed, those will be the fundamentals of compliance. So following those standards will lead to a presumption of conformity.
I can say that from an Israeli point of view, like the AI Act is a very detailed and, let's say, elaborated piece of legislation. And I think that many here in the audience will find it hard to interpret and say, okay, what exactly is more or less important and how should I treat this article or the other? Maybe you can comment that, but our recommendation goes that as soon as the Sentinel-like standard stack is ready, probably the easier, most effective, and less risky approach will be to go through the standard certification. But you can probably hear that I'm wrong.
No, I totally agree, but I wouldn't wait until the you know, the standards are ready. What I would do, you know, if I were starting an AI company right now, is I would go through the law, which is you know, a big chunk of text. But the logic of it is what I explained in the previous 2 minutes. So there's a number of checkpoints. Am I building an AI system? That's number one, right? And that then if yes, then am I in one of the high-risk categories, and is my product going to be covered by those requirements? Because again, if I'm building something in agriculture, there is absolutely no need for me to read the AI Act other than knowing, you know, what other products, more risky products what they need to do to comply. If I am in the risk category, then I go back to the requirements, which are 3 or 4 chapters that I've just enumerated. It's a big law because it also sets up governance structures, it sets up the obligations of the member states, it sets up different other pieces that work together in the very complicated European legal landscape. But ultimately, I think that following step by step through the law, at one point or another, you can identify, am I here or not? So I would not wait for the standards. I think that that's, you know, it happens to companies that are not that well prepared, right? That all of a sudden they realize, oh my God, there's this law, I need to comply with it in 3 months. The law is there, it's adopted. Yesterday was the final vote. We voted on it for like 7 times. It will be published in the European Journal soon, within the next 20 days. So that's the law, it's out there. So, you know, it would be good to go through it. But again, not to go through the whole 400 pages, but through that logic. Am I building this? Am I building a high risk? Is this going to apply to me? And then if it's yes, then there is more reading to be done.
Okay, suppose I'm this startup company. I'm part of it, okay? And we are, I don't know, 5 to 10 people, and we are creating a product in, I don't know, finance, in edutech, in whatever, legal tech, in, right? There are so many, one of the high-risk categories, okay? And I want to get prepared or start getting prepared today, even before the law comes into force and even before the standards are in place, you know. Can you give me like a 5-bullet tip? Okay, what should I do tomorrow morning?
So you're assuming, okay, I am going to probably be in a high-risk category.
Yeah, let's assume that. Let's assume
we're assuming
I'm doing an educational system. I don't know, something that personalized education. I'm most likely going to be within the, or I'm going to do health tech, something. Probably I'm going to fall within the high risk category.
So, and then you want, of course, we're assuming that you want to go to the European market and you want to get ready, you know, you want to go global from day one, right? And you're thinking, okay, how is my product going to be?
Simple fact is that European Union is the second largest export market for Israeli high tech. So, you know, good chances.
So my first step would be, you know, open the document, the law, you know, you don't need a lawyer, just read Articles 8, which underlines, okay, here are the obligations that you need to fulfill to show that your high-risk system is in conformity. And then read through the following articles, which are basically outlining what I was just saying: risk management, data governance, technical documentation, record keeping, transparency, human oversight, and cybersecurity. Those are articles 9 to 15. Those are about 7 to 8 pages. And before going to a consultancy, before going to you know, a lawyer, a highly paid lawyer, you will see, if you just read them as a developer or as a startup founder, that most of the requirements are pretty commonsensical, especially if, you know, you have built an AI company. You probably are doing that. You're probably keeping some logs because you want to follow through. You probably have some documentation. So a lot of the things that you're already doing, you will find there. And then you'll find the delta. Okay, well, actually, I am not doing this part. I better start doing it now so that when I get to actually do a conformity assessment, a full conformity assessment, you know, I'll have it ready.
When people came to me in the last 3 to 4 months and asked the same question that I proposed to you, my immediate answer was record everything. Record your decision, record your data, record your development processes, record your risk evaluation processes, record the mitigation steps that you took when you identified the risk, and so on and so forth. What do you think about this kind of recommendation?
I think that's also very useful because there is one thing, you know, I'm a European, and I worked on the law. I have a personal bias towards seeing it as beautiful, but I do understand, you know, as a liberal economist, that it's, you know, it could prove tricky, especially for small startups, micro SMEs, who don't have the resource, don't have the legal background. They are just, you know, okay, I'm building something, you know, let me build. Of course, I care about safety. I'm gonna work on that, but let me build.
I'm going to run out of cash within 12 months.
Yeah. So it is very good advice to start documenting and to, you know, to do as much of that in an automated fashion, right? To keep logs, to keep track of decisions and so on, and to think, which is not because of the EU AI Act, but the more powerful a product you build, the more you want to think how that product might pose risks. So, you know, think of a risk management system, which is, you know, one of the core requirements. So the more you think of that, you know, I'm sure when you feed data to the system, you think, okay, well, I got to use good data. I want to have quality data. The more you document that, so again, I agree with you, the more you document that, the more you think, okay, I've actually thought about biases. I've actually thought about how this might go wrong and document it, the more you will be able to match that to the requirements that are in the conformity assessment.
So follow-up question, and probably a tricky one. Suppose I already have a product on the market. It's been marketed for 3 years and it uses AI, okay? It's whether this being a digital product or whether this being a physical product, but it's already being used within the European market. And now we've got this new law that comes into force. Okay, so what should I do?
Well, you know, in European legislation, again, you know, I won't go into the technicalities. We have what we call grandfathering in clauses, because we understand that when you regulate a product that wasn't regulated before, there's a lot of that product on the market as well. And the AI Act is no exemption. So there is a grandfathering in clause which says that products already on the market by, I think, 12 months before, I would have to go back to the text to say, but I think 12 months before the entry into application of the regulation are not covered until they undergo a substantial modification, which modification means that in an AI system, to a certain extent, it literally changes the essence of your product, right? And it's especially valid in an AI system. So you have it on the market, it works, it didn't create problems. All of a sudden, you train it with, I don't know, a huge data set that is totally different, and you repurpose it, then it's basically almost like building a new product in a sense. And so it's not on the market before. Otherwise, you know, very loosely speaking, you know, Windows 95 conformity assessments should still hold for all the Windows editions out there, right? Because it's ultimately the same product. So any major change will get you in the incidence of the law, but the products on the market are not covered because of this grandfathering in clause.
But do you get some kind of a grace period, like for? I'm thinking that, you know, something that is either a digital product with the recommendation system, or I don't know, something that is already there. Okay, I acknowledge the fact that I now need to undergo the full certification, but it takes time and my product is already out there, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. If it's out there, you don't have to actually, it doesn't fall under the incidence of the AI Act. It will only do so when it undergoes a substantial modification.
Obviously, if I can anticipate a major upgrade, I should start the certification process and only launch it in Europe as soon as I get the get my product, my new version certified. That will be your comment.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
If it's already on the market and you're not planning to do a substantial change to the product in its design, in its purpose, then it won't have to comply because, you know, as I said, this is a standard grandfathering in clause. Nevertheless, at the speed at which technology moves, it's doubtful that many products, you know, many AI on the market a year ago are still going to be on the market 5 years from now without any substantive change. So,
yeah, understood. My next question will go for you know, products that have to do with an already sectoral regulated like product. Let's take for instance healthcare, medical devices. There are roughly, I don't know, several hundreds of companies in Israel, startup companies in Israel that produce medical devices that are based on AI, whether this be, you know, analysis of medical imaging or other you know, health parameters and so on and so forth. And of course, they are already regulated by a long list of regulations. So now we have this newcomer, which looks at things from an AI point of view. How does the two sets of regulations go together?
So this is, to be honest, in the 3 years or so of negotiation, we probably spent anywhere between 6 months and more than that trying to figure this out because it's very important. So I'll start with the, you know, with the logic of the AI Act. So the AI Act, regulating AI can take probably 2 forms, or 3, no regulation at all. A second one is sectoral. So you go into each sector and then you modify the regulation of that sector to update it for, you know, requirements in artificial intelligence. Or the approach that we took is a sort of a lighter touch, in a sense, horizontal regulation that covers the AI requirements and takes into account the fact that there is already regulation on the market for different other sectors. So throughout the text, I will go to practicalities as well, but throughout the text, just to say, we have, you know, provision after provision that make sure that, you know, national supervisory authorities who are going to enforce the AI Act take into account the overlap between the regulations, that providers of AI are able, if they're already regulated in the sector, to go to the same regulator with everything that they need to comply with, and to not double up the work that they do in you know, in their sector. For example, for medical devices, you have the MDR and IVDR, 2 very I would say strict regulations because it's an important sector. So compliance with the requirements there, which I'm sure include the risk management and so on, and protection of health and so on, a compliance with those would probably check, you know, a large chunk of the requirements in the Artificial Intelligence Act for the AI component, because the AI is embedded into a product, in a sense, into a system. Now, the delta, the differential, what we are trying, and we've tried in the regulation to do, is to say that can be added to or appended to the documentation that's already in place. Now, because there are so many sectoral regulations, we haven't managed to disentangle this fully and to say, this is how it's going to be for medical, this is how it's going to be for aviation, this is how it's going to be for financial. This is going to be, but we have mandated the Commission, the European Commission, to provide guidance on that particular intersection. What we've done at the higher level in the law is to say providers have the opportunity to put it all together and to go to the same regulatory authority. And we have mandated the regulatory authorities to actually work together to make sure that providers don't do double reporting and they're not double supervised. There will be some, uncertainty until the Commission provides those guidelines specifically for different sectors and how they intersect. But also the regulation applies 1 year later to all of these sectors. So while it does apply 2 years after its entry into force to high-risk systems, it will apply to those AI that are embedded in products and already regulated only 3 years after. So there is an extra year there. And within this 3-year period, there's going to be very detailed guidance coming from the Commission on how it intersects with specific sectoral regulations. I would say, it's a personal opinion because the medical and health sector are so heavily regulated that compliance with the AI Act will be basically very easy because a lot of the requirements are already checked and are fulfilled by complying with the other regulation.
But to be very practical, so I've got my medical device, or I got my health tech company, and I'm just using health here as an example vertical. But so I'm expected to approach my, let's say, native regulator, if you will, and then all of my submissions, including the deltas that are AI specific, are going to be conducted between myself and this sectoral regulator, or am I supposed to still approach the AI office of the EU or the AI authorities within the relevant EU member states? On a very practical way, how is it going to look like?
So it's good that you're pointing to me that, I assume that we have knowledge of the national regulator. So of course, when let's just say you don't have AI, you're just building a medical device. You have a presence in different member states, and there you're working probably with the National Supervisory Authority for the medical devices. As of this time, there is nothing you can do other than what I just said. Read through some of the key parts of the act. You would still go to your national regulator in the member state where you have a presence. In time, there will be guidelines from the Commission spelling out exactly what your obligations are, what the delta is. Because right now, you can have a very good lawyer look through it, and of course you can see. We have foreseen that, the elements that you do in the current regulation, you don't need to do again under the AI Act. But what I would do is I would wait for those guidelines to say, okay, well, this is exactly the delta, what I still need to do. And again, the intention is that, we still take the medical field, you would still go to the same authority, supervisory authority, but in your dossier, you will have also the delta that comes from the AI Act. For now, this day, do nothing, just follow, like I'm sure everybody does. The moment the guidelines are out, get your system in conformity with the delta, and then continue to interact with your regulator, but also, provide the additional requirements of the AI Act.
Okay, so to make a long story short, see if I got the exam correctly. I continue my regulation process with my specific sector-based regulator. I take note of the AI Act and try to analyze my gaps, again, between the current regulation and new AI regulation. I take steps that are still voluntary to close that gap. At some point in the near future, let's say in the coming year or so, the Commission is going to issue concrete guidelines. And then I also get a grace period of a year more to complete my entire certification process. Am I correct?
Voila, European law put into 20 seconds or less.
Thank you. Perhaps the last topic that I want to touch before we, open the floor for questions is the interaction between, regulation, safety, ethics, and innovation. So just to give, a little bit of background, Israel is very proud of its high-tech sector. It's very dependent on its high-tech sector. We've got approximately 9,000 high-tech companies and somewhere close to 2,300 companies that use AI. I can also say that our estimated that for the Israeli high-tech sector, it's going to be 70 to 80% of all companies that fall within the what you call high-risk categories, as opposed to the original intention for 15%. We've done like our internal analysis. And I will also say that a large portion of all those companies are very small. What you would call in Europe micro SMEs, and we would call startups, one way or the other, a dozen of people or so, funding that lasts for the next 12 months or so. And we are getting very strong voices of concern. Those startups come to us and say, guys, look, there is no way we can manage this regulation. We fear that this regulation is gonna, stifle innovation. We are very worried. Of course, we abide to the law. We don't want to breach human rights or our safety or cause systemic risk. Of course, no one wants that, but we're very concerned that the new legislation will prevent us from innovating. So what would you say to those guys?
Well, look, it's not just those guys. I think that everybody had, and again, we worked on this particular dossier coming from a very strong liberal economic background that is, believing in the power of the market and in innovation and in SMEs and startups and micro SMEs. And we have throughout thought, if you take some of, like I would say 3 priorities, it was making sure that we avoid duplications. So what we just discussed, legal clarity, because there's different ways to phrase different things, and you deal with a lot of new terminology that's never been defined in the law. So you need to make sure that lawyers can understand it, and those who have to comply with it understand it. So we focused on that, and I think probably top of our mind and of our concern was, how do we make this not only not stifle innovation, but actually support startups? So I'll give you a few of the things that are in the law that make it, more favorable to startups. And I think that the thrust of the law, if we sit down for a beer, I would say that the thrust of the law is making sure that AI is not misused, in particular when the state is involved. Right, so that would be the big, idea behind the law. So it's got nothing to do with startups trying to innovate. I think one thing is, throughout the text, we have provisions that change the logic of all the requirements when you deal with startups and SMEs. That is, for startups, for example, all these procedures and the reporting procedures and so on are simplified, right? So we have provisions that say, in the case of a startup or an SME, this can be a simplified procedure, and it's still up to, the commission to provide some guidelines on what are the key requirements and what is, only reserved for the bigger players. So that is a key provision that goes through the text. So startups will not have to do the same level of compliance work as big companies, and that's number one. Then in terms of the enforcement mechanisms, and here we're still talking just about the basic functioning of the law, but I'll also add another important element in a minute. In terms of the enforcement mechanisms, they have a different logic for SMEs and startups. So the non-compliance fines, which is basically the instrument to enforce the regulation, are different for startups and SMEs. Different in a totally different logic that would make, it would make a lot more sense for startups. Throughout the text, when we say, when there's an interaction with the regulator, we have this provision that the size of the company needs to be taken into account whenever that interaction happens. But then another critical and important element, which is, by the way, not just for European companies, but for all companies who want to go to the European market, is we have worked to establish a network of regulatory sandboxes throughout the member states. We've made these mandatory. These sandboxes are specifically built for startups and for SMEs, so they can go in, get regulatory guidance, especially if you're in a garage, all of a sudden I'm going to build this super high risk system, which might be prohibited, I don't know. But I have no idea. I know about this AI Act. You go to a sandbox, one of these sandboxes that we've established, and the regulator is there to guide you through the steps that you need to do to become compliant. It's not your personal lawyer who will certify everything for you, but it's a sandbox where you can go and you can get feedback from the regulator. And we have mandated all member states to actually have one of these sandboxes. So you can go test your product, innovate, think about, okay, am I getting out of compliance? Am I doing this right? So that's another measure. And again, recall my initial intervention. The bigger thinking is, ecosystem of trust and ecosystem of excellence. Now, when you talk about regulation, it's in this particular box, in the ecosystem of trust. There is a lot of other measures to support startups, Digital Europe, the opening up, as I mentioned, of the supercomputers for startups to run their AI on them. There's going to be a lot of funding for AI startups and so on. So these go hand in hand. But even within the AI Act, we do have all of these carve-outs in the first place, and then this network of sandboxes that is meant to help startups to get into compliance.
And those sandboxes are they're mandatory for each and every one of the member states. And I assume they're going to pop up, be created in the flow of the coming 2 years, right? That's
exactly. That's what we had intended with them. And I have to say this was almost a personal quest to make them mandatory and to make member states dedicate resources to those sandboxes so that they're there as a resource.
And maybe a peaky question, but I can imagine a tsunami of startups coming, and knocking the doors of those sandboxes, because everybody want to be compliant with the law, right? And everybody want assistance, and this is a new law with many nuances. So, are there going to be criteria for admission to those sandboxes or priorities? How is it going to run?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that, there might, or there might not be. Maybe it will become so clear through the guidelines issued by the Commission that you won't need to go to a sandbox. But there are, we have mandated the Commission to further specify criteria, selection process, and so on. You can't put all of that into regulation because it's over-regulating and over-prescriptive. What we've mandated through the regulation is that they exist, that they function, that they give priority to startups so that they can get into compliance.
Now, that's really helpful. So we have about 10 minutes left. I can see that we have about 15 questions coming from the audience. I'm going to quickly go through them and see if something, is being asked repeatedly. So give me a second. There is an interesting question here going about the chain of responsibility. This is going to be a freehand translation, but in many times an AI-based system is comprised out of components that in turn were built on, some third-party models, which in turn might be established on some yet another third-party database and so on and so forth. And someone here in the audience is concerned that the final product might not be certified because one of the earlier chains, links in the chain cannot be certified, or they do not have the details to get it certified.
I think, I won't necessarily address that concern. I'll tell you what the AI Act does. So provide the information first and then provide the opinion. We have an article dedicated to that because it is, there's a very simple product safety framework, which doesn't necessarily apply to complex value chains, right? So your basic product safety is you have a rubber ducky. Now, kids put that in the mouth. Is it safe or not, right? If it's safe, so you have one provider and then one, let's say, deployer, right, in a sense, those who sell the rubber duckies and those who make them. In AI, it's a lot more complicated than that. So we have provisions that deal with the entire value chain in the logic of, you have an original provider of a component, of a model, of something that gets integrated into another one. There are downstream obligations that are minimal, but insofar as the end product is high risk, then, all of the links in the value chain need to contribute the minimum, that is the minimum required for the product to be in compliance. It's very simplistic, but let's take two actors for now, right? Somebody's building a model, and then somebody uses that model to build a high-risk AI system, and it becomes the main provider. Okay, we got a different view for it. It becomes the main provider for that AI system, and then puts it on the market, and somebody else deploys it. The first provider has the obligation to give the second provider the elements that the second provider could not have because they don't belong with him. No more than that. So no IP is lost in the transaction from the first provider, but there is an obligation. Okay, look, I cannot comply with this documentation requirement unless you give me the documentation that you have for, I don't know, for this part. Or I cannot say that data governance is okay if you do not show me that you have complied with A and B. So we have thought of all of those because we understand that there is, it's a more complex value chain than a provider and deployer. Now, what to do if you have 25 initial providers and one of them holds key components and key information for your compliance, but they don't want to give it to you, or they can. Well, it is true that makes it difficult for you. It puts you in a bad spot. So make sure that those components that you integrate will allow you to comply, either by contractual arrangement with the initial provider that gives you the components, or by checking them beforehand that, okay, if I use this, will I be able to comply? In a sense, it's like saying, okay, if I'm building a rubber ducky, and I take this compound.
A wonderful example.
Yeah, I take this compound. I don't know what it is. Nobody can tell me what it is, but I'm going to put it in the rubber ducky anyway. Then you're not going to be able to comply with the rubber ducky requirements. So some due diligence is required, but there is also that obligation along the value chain, which makes it that you're not the one responsible for everything. Rather, the other ones are responsible to also give you the information so you can comply.
So using your example, I can go to the manufacturer of the compound and ask for, I don't know, toxicity checks, so to make sure that the compound is not toxic for children, but they don't have to give me the full details of the compound itself. So I can get
exactly. Absolutely. That's, I blabbered on too much and you put it in much simpler terms. Exactly. I need to fill in this form, which requires the toxicity. Please give me the toxicity so I can fill in the form so I know what the toxicity is.
Oh, I can get the notion of things. I get the details are going to be more complicated, but let's leave it here. A second question. Someone is asking, I'm going to read it verbally. If I'm placing an AI system that is not sold in the EU countries, but the customer may use it for EU citizens, so it's kind of the customer of a customer. Within the example here, let's say it's used for law enforcement. Do I need to consider my product as if it was placed on the EU?
Well,
so to make it simpler, I'm selling to someone. My product is not produced in the EU. It's being sold to a customer outside of the EU. But eventually, that customer sells my product to users within the EU.
Well, it's still your product in a sense, right? So in a very simple logic, of course, law enforcement can get really complicated. You can think about data exchanges, agreements, and so on, and who's using it and for what.
Let's make it simpler because law enforcement is sensitive, but I'm selling, I don't know, I'm selling whatever, tourist recommendation system. It's an Israeli product. It's been sold to Canada. And then my Canadian distributor is selling it to European citizens. So how does responsibility goes?
Well, it is deployed on the European market, right, by the Canadian company who interacts with European citizens in a sense. But again, will the travel recommendation system fall under the AI Act? No, it's more, would a Canadian company use it in employment in the European Union, in the distribution of justice, in migration, in law enforcement, in those cases that pose significant threats to health, safety, fundamental rights. And in that case, yes, it is used on the European market. But I think that there would be some questioning on the Canadian company using it without having a legal representative in the European Union to represent it, using it in those very sensitive areas who pose threats to fundamental rights. So in a sense, once your product, let's go back to the rubber ducky. Once the rubber ducky is in the hands of a kid in Europe, then you need to do the conformity assessment. It doesn't matter how exactly it gets.
Who's going to be the focal point? Am I going to be the focal point for who's the initial focal point? Let's go this way. Is this the Canadian distributor in my case? Which again should propagate the questions back to me, or am I supposed to do that to begin with?
I think it goes back to you by way of of the distribution chain, and it's again case by case. But there are provisions in the AI Act. This gets very technical, also for importers and for distributors, and the way it works, and that those importers and distributors have obligations that connect them back to the original provider, because the original provider is the only one who can do actual data governance on the way that the product is built, right? So the importers and distributors have a certain set of obligations that, again, would connect them to the initial provider. So when somebody imports, distributes a rubber ducky with that compound in it, somebody who made the ducky needs to make sure that the compound is not in, or it's not toxic.
Being mindful of the clock, although I'm having a lot of fun, I'll ask one last question coming from the audience, and that's what happens when the definitions of the risk levels themselves and the categories are being modified? And we know this is possible, like the commission can go and modify the definitions every once in a while, and people are asking, what should I do? Suppose my product came to be included or excluded from those categories based on the change.
So the definitions themselves, although the commission initially proposed that they want to modify them, we said no, so they cannot modify the definitions. But indeed, to future-proof the regulation, you need some flexibility, not just to add use cases on the high-risk, list, but also to remove them as the technology gets better and we see that, this actually poses no risk. You can simply remove it from the list. And there, it's a whole other webinar about, European law. So there's going to be a consultation procedure. There's going to be comitology passing on the secondary legislation, modifying the annex. And then there's going to be, an entry into application time for that change, just like the AI Act. But my hope is that for now there's not going to be many changes. I do want to say one more thing, which I think we went so specific that we didn't get to this topic, which I think is important. More and more of AI in the future will be built on more powerful general purpose models, right? Not just very specific, here's my scanner for checking passports. And for that, we had foreseen a more flexible, for the powerful models, which, I'm hoping everybody wants to build in the future. For those, we have foreseen a more flexible type of enforcement/governance where, the companies building those models have more of a connection to the AI office, that new body that we've established within the European Union. So though we didn't get to talk much about it, I would recommend people also look into that, into the logic that we have on what if I build a very powerful model. Then it's a different logic. It's less product safety and more, flexible enforcement and co-creation with the regulator of the rules in a sense. So that's also something important to highlight.
Wow, Dan, this was like a fascinating discussion. Let me thank you once more for joining us today. I know I could continue for an hour more, but our audience probably won't. Thank you so much for joining us and for being patient for all my questions, which were picky at times, and hope you had at least as much fun as I did.
Oh no, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Ziv and colleagues for this. And I'm sure there is a ton of questions. If I could be of help with specific questions or inclarities, look me up on LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to engage. But yeah, I hope it was useful. I had a lot of fun. So thank you for this.
Thank you very much, Dan and Ziv. And indeed, time is king, and there were many good questions that perhaps we can look into those in the future. Just to inform the audience that we aim to place the recording of the session in our online channels, be it YouTube or others, we'll see exactly. And for my part, to thank also our excellent speakers, Ziv for amazing work trying to navigate this, and Dan for being so available and willing to work with us, and hopefully to be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day.